Imagine walking into a hospital and finding every bed empty, not because people stopped getting sick, but because sickness itself became impossible. Picture turning on the news to see storms calming at a single word, the dead rising from their graves, and hunger ending forever with a handful of bread. This isn't fantasy. This is what our world would look like if one moment in history had gone differently. What if Jesus had never left? What if the miracles that amazed the ancient world had continued unbroken for over 2,000 years? Welcome to our channel, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden truths of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. Let us take you back to the shores of an ancient sea, where the impossible first became reality, and discover what might have been if heaven had chosen a different path. Chapter 1: The Waters That Changed Everything. The fishing nets hung heavy in Peter's weathered hands as he watched the stranger approach their boat. The Sea of Galilee stretched endlessly before them, its waves catching the morning light like scattered coins. This carpenter from Nazareth had been teaching crowds for months, but what happened next would shatter every law of nature they thought they knew. "Put out into deep water," Jesus said simply. "Let down your nets for a catch." Peter wanted to argue. They had fished all night and caught nothing. The fish weren't biting, and this teacher knew nothing about fishing. But something in those eyes made him obey. The nets went down into the dark water, and what came up defied all logic. Fish. Thousands of them. So many that the nets began tearing under the weight. Peter's boat started sinking from the massive catch, and they had to call another boat to help. In minutes, they had more fish than they could sell in a year. Peter fell to his knees, trembling. This was just the beginning. Over the next 3 years, crowds would watch in amazement as Jesus turned water into the finest wine at a wedding celebration. They would see him walk across stormy waves like they were solid ground. 5,000 hungry people would eat until they were full from just 5 small loaves and 2 fish. The blind received sight with a touch of mud and spit. The paralyzed jumped up from their mats and danced. Lepers found their skin clean and new. Even death itself had no power when Jesus spoke a person's name. But perhaps most shocking of all was how normal it became to those who followed him. After months of impossible miracles, the disciples started expecting the supernatural. They learned to bring the sick wherever Jesus went. They watched him calm storms with a word and raise the dead with a prayer. Then came the cross. The miracles seemed to end with his death, flickering back briefly after his resurrection, before disappearing entirely when he ascended to heaven. The age of miracles, according to most people, had ended. Chapter 2: The Final Breath That Silenced Heaven. The tomb stood empty on that first Easter morning, but something had changed in the spiritual realm forever. For 40 days after his resurrection, Jesus appeared to his followers, teaching them and showing them his wounds. The disciples' hearts burned with hope. Surely now the real ministry would begin. Surely now the miracles would multiply beyond anything they had seen. But then came the moment that shaped the next 2,000 years of human history. On a hill outside Jerusalem, Jesus gathered his closest friends for the last time. His feet began to lift from the ground. The clouds opened to receive him. His voice echoed one final promise: "I will be with you always, even to the end of the age." And then he was gone. The disciples stood staring at the empty sky, angels asking why they gazed upward when there was work to do on earth. The Holy Spirit would come with power, they were told. Signs and wonders would continue through their hands. But it would never be the same as having Jesus physically present, healing every sickness and raising every dead person they encountered. Over the following decades, the apostles did perform miracles. Peter's shadow healed people as he walked by. Paul raised the dead and survived deadly snake bites. But gradually, as the original witnesses died off, the frequency of miraculous interventions seemed to decrease. By the 2nd century, church leaders were debating whether the charismatic gifts had ceased entirely. Some claimed they continued in secret. Others insisted the age of miracles had ended with the completion of Scripture. The supernatural became the exception rather than the rule. Centuries passed. Hospitals were built because sickness remained unconquered. Funeral homes thrived because death kept its grip on humanity. Natural disasters devastated communities because storms no longer obeyed human voices. The world learned to live without expecting daily miracles. But what if that moment on the hillside had gone differently? What if Jesus had made a choice that would have changed everything? Chapter 3. The moment heaven chose differently. Picture that same hill outside Jerusalem, but imagine the scene unfolding in an entirely different way. The disciples gather around Jesus, expecting their final goodbye. They had grown accustomed to loss by now. They thought they had lost him forever at the cross before he surprised them with resurrection. Jesus looks into their eyes, seeing their fear about facing the world without him. He sees the future spread before him, centuries of his followers struggling to believe in miracles they could not see, churches split over whether supernatural gifts still existed, people dying from diseases he could heal with a word. "I know what the Father's plan has been," Jesus says quietly, "but I choose to stay." The words hang in the air like lightning about to strike. The disciples don't understand at first. Stay? What does that mean? The angels who had been preparing to escort him to his heavenly throne freeze in confusion. This was not the script they had been given. "The world is not ready to be left alone," Jesus continues. "My sheep need their shepherd. The sick need their healer. The dead need someone who holds the keys to life itself." In that moment, everything changes. Instead of ascending, Jesus plants his feet firmly on earth and declares his intention to remain physically present until every person has had the chance to experience the love of God through direct miracle. The immediate response is chaos. The disciples fall to their faces in worship and terror. If Jesus is staying, what does that mean for the Great Commission? How do you preach about a coming kingdom when the king refuses to leave? What happens to faith when sight becomes the normal way of knowing God? Word spreads quickly through Jerusalem. The man they crucified is not only alive, he's refusing to leave. Roman soldiers receive orders to arrest this troublemaker once and for all, but their swords pass through him like mist when he chooses not to be touched. Their chains cannot hold someone who walked through locked doors and appeared in rooms at will. Within days, crowds begin gathering from every nation, not just to hear teaching this time, but because word is spreading that every sick person who approaches this Jesus leaves completely healed. Every dead person brought to him returns to life. Every impossible need gets met through supernatural provision. The age of perpetual miracles has begun. Chapter 4. When hospitals became obsolete. 6 months after Jesus chose to remain on earth, the first hospital in Jerusalem closes its doors, not from lack of funding, but from lack of patience. Every morning, crowds bring their sick to wherever Jesus is teaching, and every evening, they carry home completely healthy family members. Cancer dissolves at his touch, like ice in sunlight. Broken bones mend instantly when he speaks their healing. Birth defects correct themselves when loving hands are laid on children. Mental illnesses flee like demons at his command. Even aging begins to reverse in some cases, as people who have walked with him for months appear younger and stronger than when they first met him. The medical community struggles to understand what they're witnessing. Greek physicians who have spent lifetimes studying anatomy find their knowledge useless when bodies remake themselves in seconds. Egyptian healers trained in herbs and potions watch their customers disappear as free, instant healing becomes available to anyone willing to ask. But the changes go far beyond individual healing. Jesus begins teaching his followers to do what he does. "The works that I do, you will do also," he had promised before. Now he makes good on that promise with hands-on training. Peter learns to speak creative words over missing limbs and watch them grow back. John discovers he can multiply food just by praying over it with faith. Even newer disciples find they can heal diseases they've never seen before. Economic systems start crumbling under the weight of supernatural abundance. Merchants who sold medicine find their goods worthless. Farmers who charge high prices during famines watch Jesus feed thousands with a few fish and loaves. Money becomes less important when the most valuable things in life, health, food, even life itself, are freely given to anyone who asks. Religious leaders face the most difficult adjustment of all. For centuries, they have controlled access to God through complicated rules and expensive sacrifices. Now anyone can approach Jesus directly and receive immediate, undeniable answers to prayer. Temple revenues plummet as people discover they don't need to pay for what God gives freely. The psychological impact on humanity proves even more profound than the physical changes. For the first time in history, parents don't lie awake at night fearing their children might die. Elderly people stop dreading the approach of death. Chronic pain becomes a memory that older generations tell stories about. But perhaps most shocking of all is how quickly the impossible becomes normal again. Chapter 5. The Day Death Surrendered. It happens on a Thursday morning in the busy streets of Jerusalem. A young boy chases a ball into traffic and is struck by a merchant's cart. His small body lies motionless in the dust as his mother's screams pierce the air. Crowds gather, shaking their heads sadly. Another tragedy, another reminder that life is fragile. Then someone shouts, "Get Jesus! Someone find Jesus!" Within minutes, the teacher from Nazareth pushes through the crowd. He kneels beside the broken child, placing gentle hands on the still chest. The mother sobs beside him, beyond hope, but desperate enough to let this miracle worker try. "Talitha cum," Jesus whispers, using the same words he had spoken to Jairus' daughter years before. "Little one, get up." The child's eyes flutter open. Color returns to pale cheeks. Small arms stretch as if waking from a pleasant nap. The boy sits up, looks around at the amazed crowd, and asks his mother why everyone is crying. That resurrection sends shockwaves through the ancient world like nothing before it. If Jesus could raise someone who had just died, what about people who had been dead for days, weeks, years? The answer comes quickly. Families begin bringing their deceased loved ones, some recently dead, others long buried. To everyone's amazement, the length of time doesn't seem to matter. Bodies that have been in tombs for months return to life as easily as those who died minutes before. The first mass resurrection happens in a cemetery outside Jerusalem. Hundreds of grieving families gather with their dead, hoping against hope. Jesus walks among the tombs, speaking names and commanding life to return. One by one, burial cloths begin moving. Stone lids shift as their occupants sit up. The dead wake up like sleepers, hearing their names called for breakfast. Within weeks, graveyards across the Roman Empire begin emptying as news spreads, and families make pilgrimages to wherever Jesus is teaching. Funeral directors find themselves out of work overnight. Professional mourners seek new careers. The entire industry built around death and grief collapses because death itself has lost its sting. But the theological implications prove even more challenging than the practical ones. If anyone can be raised from the dead simply by asking Jesus, what happens to concepts of judgment, heaven, and hell? If death is no longer permanent, do people still need to fear the consequences of their choices? Some of the resurrected bring back stories of what they experienced while dead, accounts that don't always match traditional religious teachings. Others return with no memory of anything beyond their death, as if they had simply been sleeping. These inconsistencies spark fierce debates among religious scholars about the nature of life after death. More troubling questions emerge as the resurrections continue. Some people who return to life don't want to be back. Others seem different, changed in ways their families can't understand. A few appear to age backwards, becoming younger each day after their resurrection. And then there are those who die again and again, only to be raised repeatedly, as if death and life have become revolving doors rather than permanent states. Chapter 6. Empires bow to the carpenter. News reaches Caesar's palace in Rome like a plague of impossible reports. Governors send frantic messages describing a Jewish teacher who cannot be killed, whose followers are multiplying across the empire, and whose supernatural abilities make Roman military might look like children playing with wooden swords. Emperor Tiberius calls an emergency session of the Senate. The most powerful military force in human history faces its first truly unconquerable opponent, not because of superior weapons or strategy, but because their enemy operates outside the laws of physics entirely. "Send the legions," one senator suggests. "Crucify him again if necessary." "We tried that already," comes the grim response. "He came back from the dead." "Our soldiers report that weapons pass through him when he chooses not to be touched. Our chains cannot hold someone who walks through walls." The first military expedition sent to arrest Jesus ends in complete conversion rather than conquest. An entire Roman century, 100 of their finest soldiers, returned to Rome as followers of the carpenter from Nazareth. They report that watching him heal their wounded comrades and feed their entire unit with a handful of bread convinced them that opposing such power was not just futile, but wrong. Political structures across the empire begin shifting as news spreads that there is a higher authority than Caesar, one who proves his power through love rather than fear. Provincial governors find their subjects less willing to pay taxes when they know someone exists who can multiply resources infinitely. Roman courts struggle to maintain order when people claim divine authority overrules human law. The economic implications prove even more destabilizing than the political ones. Roman wealth was built on conquest, slavery, and the control of resources. But what happens to an economy based on scarcity when someone can create abundance at will? How do you maintain social hierarchies when supernatural power is available to anyone, regardless of their social status? Trade routes that made Rome wealthy become less important when goods can be multiplied rather than transported. Military conquest loses its appeal when the conquered territories offer nothing that cannot be created through divine intervention. The very foundations of imperial power, the ability to control resources and project force, crumble when faced with unlimited supernatural provision. Some Roman leaders attempt to co-opt Jesus rather than oppose him. They offer him position, wealth, and political power in exchange for using his abilities to strengthen the empire. These negotiations fail completely when Jesus makes it clear that his kingdom operates on principles directly opposite to imperial conquest. Other officials try more subtle approaches, attempting to regulate or tax miraculous activities. These efforts prove equally futile when divine power refuses to operate within human bureaucratic structures. Within 5 years of Jesus' decision to remain on earth, the Roman Empire finds itself in the unprecedented position of sharing authority with a power they cannot understand, control, or defeat. Chapter 7. Science rewrites its rules. The greatest minds of the ancient world gather in Alexandria's famous library, struggling to make sense of reports flooding in from across the known world. Natural philosophers who have spent lifetimes studying the behavior of matter, energy, and life itself find their carefully observed principles thrown into chaos by daily miracles. Archimedes' laws of physics seem to have exceptions when Jesus walks on water. Mathematical principles of multiplication fail to explain how 5 loaves become food for thousands. Medical understanding based on anatomy and physiology becomes useless when dead tissue springs back to life at a spoken word. The challenge goes beyond simply observing impossible events. Scientific method depends on reproducible results under controlled conditions, but Jesus' miracles seem to operate according to spiritual rather than physical laws. Faith, love, and divine will become variables that no human experiment can control or measure. Some scholars attempt to develop new frameworks that incorporate supernatural intervention into natural law. They theorize about higher dimensions of reality where spiritual forces can override physical limitations. Others propose that what appears miraculous might actually represent advanced understanding of natural principles that human science has not yet discovered. These efforts lead to fascinating hybrid disciplines that blend empirical observation with theological study. Physician theologians emerge who study both anatomy and spiritual healing. Natural philosophers begin investigating the relationship between moral law and physical law, noting that Jesus' miracles always serve love rather than selfish purposes. The development of new experimental methods becomes necessary when traditional scientific approaches prove inadequate for studying supernatural phenomena. Researchers learn to include prayer, faith, and moral preparation as essential elements in their investigations. Double-blind studies become impossible when the consciousness and intent of both researcher and subject affect the outcomes. Medical schools begin teaching courses in miraculous healing alongside traditional anatomy and herbal medicine. Students learn to recognize conditions that respond to prayer as readily as those requiring physical treatment. The line between science and spirituality blurs as both prove necessary for understanding the world they live in. Perhaps most significantly, the purpose of scientific inquiry itself begins changing. Instead of seeking to control natural forces for human benefit, scholars increasingly focus on understanding how to align human will with divine purposes to bring about beneficial outcomes for all creation. Technology development takes unexpected directions when human needs are met through supernatural provision rather than mechanical innovation. Instead of building complex machines to solve problems, Inventors focus on creating tools that help people connect more effectively with divine power. Chapter 8. Religions Face Their Maker. The Temple in Jerusalem becomes the epicenter of the most dramatic religious upheaval in human history. For centuries, Jewish religious leaders have taught about a coming Messiah who would restore Israel's glory. Now that Messiah stands in their courts, performing undeniable miracles and refusing to fit their expectations, High Priest Caiaphas faces an impossible situation. The man his council condemned as a blasphemer has returned from death with powers that surpass anything in Jewish scripture. Every day brings new reports of miraculous healings, resurrections, and supernatural provision that fulfill messianic prophecies, while simultaneously challenging established religious authority. Some Pharisees and Sadducees humble themselves and acknowledge Jesus as the promised Messiah. They restructure their entire theological framework around the reality of God walking among them. Others resist desperately, claiming that such obvious supernatural power must somehow be demonic deception rather than divine truth. The conflict splits Judaism into multiple factions. Traditional Jews who accept Jesus as Messiah find themselves worshipping alongside Gentiles who have also been drawn to his miraculous ministry. This creates unprecedented theological challenges about the nature of covenant relationship and chosen people status. Meanwhile, pagan religions across the Roman Empire face their own crisis of faith. Temples devoted to Greek and Roman gods find their attendance dropping dramatically as people witness the superior power of the Jewish Messiah. When Zeus fails to answer prayers, but Jesus heals every request, religious loyalty shifts quickly toward demonstrated divine ability. Some pagan priests attempt to explain Jesus' miracles within their existing theological frameworks, claiming he must be a manifestation of their own deities. Others acknowledge that their gods have been proven inferior and convert to following the Jewish carpenter. The most honest simply close their temples and seek other occupations. Eastern religions encounter Jesus through trade routes and traveling merchants who bring reports of his miracles. Buddhist and Hindu teachers debate whether his abilities represent the achievement of enlightenment, divine avatar status, or something entirely unprecedented in their spiritual frameworks. Islamic teachers, centuries later, will struggle with historical accounts of Jesus' continued earthly presence, as this directly contradicts Quranic teaching about his ascension. Some Islamic scholars propose that these accounts represent later Christian fabrications, while others suggest that Allah chose to extend Jesus' earthly ministry beyond what was originally planned. The emergence of new religious movements becomes inevitable as people attempt to organize worship around direct access to divine power. Some groups focus on healing ministries, others on miraculous provision, still others on resurrection experiences. Traditional religious structures prove inadequate for containing the spiritual explosion that results from ongoing divine intervention. Chapter 9. Art, Born from Wonder. In workshops across the Mediterranean world, artists put down their traditional tools and stare at blank canvases, wondering how to capture the impossible scenes they witness daily. How do you paint water becoming wine? How do you sculpt the moment when death surrenders to life? How do you write poetry about the routine miracle of feeding thousands with a handful of bread? The challenge transforms human creativity in unprecedented ways. Painters develop new techniques for depicting supernatural light, the glow that seems to emanate from Jesus during his most powerful miracles. Sculptors experiment with materials and methods that can convey the dynamic motion of paralyzed limbs suddenly dancing with joy. Music undergoes perhaps the most dramatic evolution. Composers find that traditional scales and harmonies seem inadequate for expressing the emotions that arise from witnessing daily miracles. New musical forms emerge that incorporate elements of worship, celebration, and awe into complex symphonic arrangements that attempt to echo the harmony between heaven and earth. Poets struggle with language itself, discovering that existing vocabulary lacks words for experiences that transcend normal human understanding. New literary genres develop that blend historical narrative with theological reflection and personal testimony. Epic poems emerge that chronicle the ongoing adventures of Jesus and his followers as they transform communities across the known world. Theatre takes on new meaning when actors can portray biblical stories with technical advice from eyewitnesses. Dramatists work closely with disciples who were present at original miracle events, ensuring that their performances accurately represent supernatural interventions that audiences might witness themselves at any moment. Architecture evolves to accommodate the massive crowds that gather wherever Jesus teaches. Traditional buildings prove inadequate for the numbers of people seeking healing and miracles. New construction techniques develop that allow for rapid assembly of large gathering spaces that can be moved as Jesus travels from place to place. Visual arts become important historical records as artists document miraculous events for future generations. Detailed paintings and mosaics preserve accurate depictions of supernatural healings, resurrections, and provision miracles. These works serve both artistic and documentary purposes, providing evidence of divine intervention for skeptical future audiences. The patronage system supporting artists changes dramatically as wealthy individuals discover that investing in miracle documentation brings them into closer contact with divine power. Art commissions increasingly focus on religious themes as secular subjects seem less significant compared to the supernatural events occurring daily. Chapter 10. The Children Who Never Knew Suffering. In a small village outside Damascus, 8-year-old Sarah plays games that would be impossible in any other generation. She and her friends take turns pretending to be dead so others can practice resurrection prayers they've learned from watching Jesus. To them, death is just a temporary inconvenience, like taking a nap. These children represent humanity's first generation to grow up with unlimited access to divine power. They have never known hunger because food multiplies whenever it's needed. They have never feared sickness because healing happens as naturally as breathing. They have never mourned permanent loss because death has become reversible. Their psychological development follows patterns never before seen in human history. Traditional childhood fears, monsters, darkness, separation from parents, hold no terror for children who have watched Jesus calm storms and raise the dead. Instead, they develop confidence and security that amazes adults who grew up in a world of scarcity and mortality. Educational systems struggle to adapt to children whose expectations and capabilities exceed anything previous generations have experienced. These young people learn to read using miracle stories as their primary texts. They study mathematics through exercises in supernatural multiplication. Their understanding of natural science includes spiritual intervention as a normal variable in physical processes. Social development among miracle generation children follows unique patterns. They show less competition and aggression because abundance eliminates the need to fight over resources. They demonstrate greater empathy and compassion because they have witnessed divine love expressed through constant healing and provision. However, educators and parents begin noticing unexpected challenges as well. Some children seem to lack appreciation for basic necessities because they have never experienced want. Others show impatience with natural processes, expecting everything to happen as quickly as miraculous interventions. The generational gap between children who have always known miracles and adults who remember life before Jesus' continued presence creates unprecedented family dynamics. Parents find themselves learning from their children about faith and expectation, while children struggle to understand their parents' caution and doubt. Religious education takes on entirely new meaning when children can ask Jesus directly about spiritual questions and receive immediate, personal answers. Traditional teaching methods based on memorizing ancient texts become less important than developing personal relationships with the divine teacher who remains physically present among them. These miracle generation children begin displaying unusual spiritual abilities at young ages. Some show natural gifts for healing prayer that surpass their parents' capabilities. Others demonstrate prophetic insights or supernatural knowledge that suggests they are developing differently than any previous generation of humans. Chapter 11. The Gospels They Tried to Hide. Deep beneath the monastery of St. Catherine in the Sinai Desert, a monk named Brother Marcus makes a discovery that will shake the foundations of established Christianity. Hidden in a sealed jar behind a false wall, he finds ancient papyri containing gospel accounts that never made it into the official biblical canon. These texts, written in the same period as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell a dramatically different story about Jesus' intentions for miraculous ministry. Instead of promising to send the Holy Spirit and leave, these hidden Gospels quote Jesus as declaring his intention to remain on earth until every person has experienced God's love through direct supernatural intervention. "I will not ascend to my Father," reads one passage, "until the last child has been healed, the final grave has been emptied, and every tear has been dried by the hand of divine love. My kingdom is not delayed until heaven. It begins now, on earth, through signs and wonders that will never cease." Church historians struggle to explain why such significant texts were excluded from the biblical canon. Some propose that early church councils deliberately suppressed accounts that suggested ongoing miraculous ministry, preferring to emphasize Jesus' heavenly reign rather than continued earthly presence. Archaeological evidence begins supporting these alternative gospel accounts. Excavations in ancient Christian communities uncover inscriptions and artifacts suggesting that first-century believers expected Jesus to remain physically present throughout the church age. Prayer formulas carved in stone ask for healing from our Lord who walks among us still. The political implications of these discoveries prove explosive. If legitimate gospel accounts support the possibility of continued miraculous ministry, then centuries of church teaching about the cessation of supernatural gifts require complete reconsideration. Denominations that built their theology around the absence of ongoing miracles face fundamental challenges to their doctrinal foundations. Some religious scholars embrace these findings as vindication for charismatic and Pentecostal movements that have always insisted on the continuation of spiritual gifts. Others resist fiercely, questioning the authenticity of manuscripts that contradict established theological positions. The debate intensifies when linguistic analysis confirms that these hidden gospels employ the same vocabulary, grammar, and writing styles as the canonical texts. Carbon dating places their composition within decades of the accepted gospel accounts. Textual criticism finds no evidence of later interpolation or editing. Perhaps most compelling of all, these alternative gospels contain detailed prophecies about future historical events that proved accurate, as if their authors possessed supernatural knowledge about the consequences of Jesus remaining on earth rather than ascending to heaven. Chapter 12. When Saints Walked Among Us. The official records tell one story about church history, but hidden archives in monasteries across Europe preserve a very different account. According to these secret documents, miraculous gifts never actually ceased after the apostolic age. They were simply driven underground by religious and political authorities who found uncontrolled supernatural power threatening to their institutional control. Saint Martin of Tours, according to suppressed testimonies, didn't just perform occasional healings as the approved biographies claim. Eyewitness accounts describe him routinely raising the dead, multiplying food for entire communities, and demonstrating supernatural abilities that rivaled those recorded in the New Testament. Church officials of his era carefully edited these reports to make his miracles seem rare and exceptional rather than daily occurrences. Similar patterns emerge throughout church history when researchers gain access to previously classified documents. Saint Francis of Assisi apparently healed every sick person brought to him and spoke regularly with animals in ways that went far beyond legendary accounts. Joan of Arc's supernatural experiences included not just mystical visions, but documented cases of miraculous provision and divine protection that military historians had been instructed to explain away. Monastic communities preserved the most detailed records of ongoing miraculous activity. Benedictine monasteries maintained careful logs of supernatural healings, prophetic revelations, and miraculous provision that occurred within their communities. These chronicles were kept secret because church hierarchy feared that widespread knowledge of continuing miracles would undermine clerical authority and institutional control. The Knights Templar apparently discovered evidence during their occupation of Jerusalem that Jesus had promised his miracles would continue until his second coming. This knowledge, according to encoded documents found in their secret archives, formed the basis for their mysterious rituals and their confidence in divine protection. Their persecution and suppression may have been motivated as much by their supernatural beliefs as by their political power. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther encountered much more miraculous activity than their official biographies acknowledge. Contemporary witnesses describe healing services, supernatural provision during times of persecution, and prophetic insights that guided the Reformation movement. These accounts were minimized in later historical records to avoid association with Catholic miracle claims. The Moravian missionary movement of the 18th century apparently operated with continuous miraculous backing that enabled their unprecedented success in reaching remote cultures. Their private correspondence describes regular divine interventions, supernatural protection in dangerous situations, and communication abilities that transcended normal linguistic barriers. Even in more recent centuries, documented cases of sustained miraculous ministry were systematically discredited or explained away by ecclesiastical authorities who preferred controllable religious experience over unpredictable supernatural intervention. Chapter 13. The Vatican's Deepest Secret. Cardinal Alessandro Torretti receives the most classified assignment in Vatican history: investigate persistent rumors that the Church's secret archives contain documented proof that Jesus never intended his miraculous ministry to end with his ascension. The implications of such evidence would fundamentally challenge Catholic teaching about the nature of Christ's continuing presence in the world. Descending into restricted levels beneath St. Peter's Basilica that few humans have ever seen, Turretti discovers files dating back to the earliest papal administrations. These documents reveal a pattern of systematic suppression of miracle testimonies that church officials found theologically or politically inconvenient. The archives contain detailed investigations of countless supernatural events throughout church history, healings that surpassed medical explanation, resurrections witnessed by multiple credible sources, and provision miracles that fed entire communities during famines. In case after case, church investigators confirmed the authenticity of these events, while simultaneously deciding to classify them as secret rather than celebrate them publicly. Political motivations become clear as Turretti reads correspondence between church officials and secular authorities. Rulers throughout history pressured religious leaders to downplay miraculous claims that might encourage popular movements or challenge governmental authority. Kings and emperors understood that widespread belief in accessible divine power could threaten their own political control. Economic factors also influenced church policy toward miracles. Documented supernatural healings and provision could undermine the church's revenue from selling indulgences, conducting expensive healing rituals, and maintaining exclusive access to divine intervention. Miracle testimonies were often suppressed to protect institutional financial interests. The most shocking discovery comes in files from the 16th century, when church officials apparently possessed physical evidence supporting Jesus' promise to remain supernaturally active on earth until his second coming. This evidence was deemed so dangerous to establish theological positions that it was classified beyond even papal access and hidden in the deepest levels of the secret archives. Turretti's investigation reveals that numerous saints and mystics throughout church history claimed direct revelation from Jesus, confirming his continued miraculous ministry. These testimonies were systematically discredited or reinterpreted to align with official doctrine about the cessation of apostolic gifts. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the archives contain records of church officials actively working to prevent or discredit genuine miraculous events when they occurred outside official ecclesiastical channels. Independent miracle workers were persecuted not because their abilities were false, but because they demonstrated divine power operating without institutional mediation. As Cardinal Turretti completes his investigation, he faces an impossible choice: reveal evidence that could revolutionize Christian understanding of miraculous ministry, or continue the centuries-old pattern of protecting institutional authority over unpredictable divine intervention. Chapter 14: Islam's Hidden Prophecies. In the ancient library of Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Islamic scholar Dr. Fatima al-Rashid makes a discovery that challenges everything she thought she knew about Christian-Muslim theological differences. Hidden within commentaries on obscure Quranic verses, she finds references to Jesus' miraculous ministry that suggest Islamic prophecy may have anticipated his continued earthly presence. The Quran speaks respectfully of Jesus as a miracle worker, acknowledging his ability to heal the sick, raise the dead, and perform supernatural signs. But buried in classical Arabic commentaries, Dr. al-Rashid discovers interpretations suggesting these abilities were meant to continue until the day of judgment, rather than ending with his ascension. Verse 4, 158, which speaks of Jesus being raised up by Allah, has been interpreted by most Islamic scholars as describing his bodily ascension to heaven. But earlier commentators apparently understood this passage differently, suggesting that Jesus was raised up to a higher level of earthly ministry rather than removed from earth entirely. Hadith collections contain even more explicit references to Jesus's ongoing miraculous activity. Several authentic traditions describe the Prophet Muhammad receiving visions of Jesus continuing his healing ministry among various communities until the end times. These accounts were apparently marginalized by later Islamic theologians who preferred interpretations that emphasized Muhammad's role as the final prophet. The discovery becomes more intriguing when Dr. al-Rashid realizes that Islamic prophecies about Jesus' return during the last days might actually describe his continuous presence rather than a future second coming. If Jesus never left Earth, then prophecies about his end times ministry could refer to the culmination of ongoing supernatural activity rather than a dramatic reappearance. Sufi mystical traditions preserve the most explicit accounts of Jesus' continued miraculous presence. Sufi masters throughout Islamic history reported encounters with Jesus in both visionary and apparently physical forms. These experiences included healing miracles, supernatural provision, and prophetic insights that guided Islamic spiritual development. The theological implications prove challenging for traditional Islamic doctrine. If Jesus remained on earth performing ongoing miracles, how does this affect Muslim understanding of Muhammad as the seal of the prophets? Can two divine messengers operate simultaneously without contradicting Islamic monotheism? Some Islamic scholars begin proposing that Jesus' continued miraculous ministry serves Allah's purposes by preparing humanity for the final revelation brought through Muhammad. Others suggest that ongoing Christian miracles represent a different type of divine intervention that complements rather than contradicts Islamic teaching. The discovery raises uncomfortable questions about centuries of Christian-Muslim conflict. If both traditions contain prophetic support for Jesus' continuing supernatural ministry, why have believers in these faiths spent so much energy fighting each other instead of recognizing their common ground in acknowledging divine miraculous intervention? Chapter 15: The Eastern Connection. Professor Rajesh Sharma at Banaras Hindu University stumbles upon Sanskrit texts that seem to describe Jesus-like miracles occurring in ancient India centuries before Christian missionaries arrived. These accounts speak of a divine teacher who healed the sick, raised the dead, and multiplied food, abilities traditionally associated with Hindu avatars, but remarkably similar to gospel narratives. The Bhagavata Purana contains passages describing supernatural healing abilities that match Christian miracle accounts with striking precision. Divine figures in Hindu tradition demonstrate power over disease, death, and natural elements in ways that parallel Jesus' ministry. Some scholars begin wondering whether these traditions reflect universal divine principles or ancient cross-cultural contact. Buddhist texts from Tibet preserve stories of enlightened masters whose supernatural abilities included healing touch, multiplication of resources, and even resurrection of the dead. These accounts predate Christian missionary activity in the region by centuries, suggesting either independent spiritual revelation or connections between Eastern and Western miracle traditions that historians have overlooked. The Silk Road trade routes that connected East and West during the early Christian centuries may have carried more than commercial goods. Archaeological evidence suggests that communities along these routes preserved miracle traditions that combined Christian, Hindu, and Buddhist elements in syncretic spiritual practices that emphasized supernatural healing and provision. Chinese historical records contain references to Western teachers who demonstrated miraculous abilities during the Tang Dynasty period. These accounts describe healing miracles and supernatural provision that occurred in Chinese communities, performed by foreigners whose descriptions match early Christian missionary reports. The theological implications challenge traditional religious boundaries. If multiple spiritual traditions independently developed similar miracle practices, this could suggest either universal access to divine power or common historical sources for supernatural ministry techniques. Modern interfaith dialogue takes on new dimensions when representatives of different religions discover they share more common ground in miraculous experience than their theological differences might suggest. Healing ministries emerge that incorporate Christian prayer, Hindu mantras, and Buddhist meditation in combined approaches to supernatural intervention. Some religious scholars propose that the division between Eastern and Western miracle traditions is artificial, that divine power operates according to universal spiritual principles rather than denominational boundaries. Others maintain that superficial similarities mask fundamental theological differences about the nature and source of supernatural abilities. The discovery of Eastern connections to Christian miracle traditions raises intriguing possibilities about the scope of divine intervention in human history. Perhaps the boundaries between religions are less significant than the common human experience of encountering supernatural power through faith, compassion, and spiritual discipline. Chapter 16: Silicon Valley meets Galilee. In the gleaming headquarters of Tech Miracle Corporation in Palo Alto, CEO Jennifer Martinez stares at financial projections that would have seemed impossible just 5 years ago. Her company's revolutionary medical devices, once worth billions, are now nearly worthless because prayer has proven more effective than technology for healing human disease. The transformation began when authenticated videos of miraculous healings started going viral on social media platforms. At first, tech companies tried to profit from miracle documentation, developing sophisticated apps for recording and analyzing supernatural events. But they quickly discovered that divine power doesn't operate according to algorithmic principles or submit to digital analysis. Artificial intelligence research hits unprecedented obstacles when researchers realize that the most important questions about reality cannot be answered through data processing alone. AI systems trained on miracle testimonies produce contradictory results because supernatural intervention operates according to spiritual rather than logical principles. Medical technology companies face complete market collapse as hospitals worldwide report dramatic decreases in patient admissions. When broken bones heal instantly through prayer and terminal diseases disappear after miraculous intervention, advanced medical equipment becomes as obsolete as bloodletting tools. Billions of dollars in research investment prove worthless overnight. Social media platforms struggle with content moderation when miracle videos flood their systems. Traditional fact-checking methods fail when supernatural events cannot be verified through normal journalistic standards. Platforms find themselves in the impossible position of either censoring documented divine interventions or allowing their systems to be overwhelmed by miracle testimonies. Pharmaceutical companies watch their stock prices plummet as medications become unnecessary for conditions that respond immediately to supernatural healing. The global drug market, worth trillions of dollars, faces extinction when divine intervention proves more effective than chemical compounds for treating human ailments. Tech entrepreneurs attempt to pivot their businesses towards serving miracle-based communities, developing apps for organizing healing services, coordinating prayer networks, and documenting supernatural provision. However, they discover that digital solutions seem inferior to direct spiritual connection for most miracle-related activities. The venture capital industry struggles to evaluate investments when the most valuable commodity, access to divine power, cannot be monetized through traditional business models. Startups claiming to enhance or facilitate miraculous experiences attract massive funding despite having no measurable products or services. Some technology companies embrace the supernatural transformation by developing tools that support rather than compete with miraculous ministry. These platforms focus on connecting people who need prayer with those gifted in supernatural healing, creating global networks of divine intervention that operate outside traditional healthcare systems. Chapter 17: Politics in the Age of Prophets. President Sarah Williams sits in the Oval Office facing the most unprecedented crisis in American political history. How do you govern a nation when divine authority provides clear moral guidance on every policy issue? Traditional democratic processes become obsolete when supernatural intervention offers definitive answers to questions that once required political debate. Congressional hearings take on surreal qualities as legislators attempt to draft laws governing miraculous activity. How do you regulate healing services when the power source operates outside human authority? What taxes apply to supernaturally multiplied resources? How do courts handle disputes when divine intervention can instantly reveal truth or falsehood? The Department of Health faces complete reorganization as miracle healing eliminates most traditional medical needs. Hospitals request government assistance, transitioning to new roles as community centers and spiritual retreat facilities. The CDC struggles to track disease patterns when supernatural intervention makes epidemiological data meaningless. International relations transform dramatically when some nations embrace miraculous ministry, while others attempt to resist or regulate it. Trade agreements become irrelevant when countries with active miracle ministries can produce unlimited resources through supernatural multiplication. Military alliances shift as nations discover that divine protection offers better security than conventional weapons. The Federal Reserve grapples with monetary policy in an economy where scarcity, the fundamental assumption underlying all economic theory, no longer applies to basic human needs. Currency values fluctuate wildly as markets struggle to price goods and services that can be created supernaturally without traditional production costs. Election campaigns focus increasingly on candidates' spiritual qualifications rather than their policy positions. Voters want leaders who can facilitate divine intervention rather than those who promise governmental solutions to problems. Campaign rallies become healing services where political speeches are interrupted by spontaneous miracles. The Supreme Court faces constitutional questions that the founders never anticipated. Does religious freedom include the right to perform public miracles? Can government agencies discriminate against supernatural healing in favor of conventional medicine? How does separation of church and state principles apply when divine authority demonstrates superior effectiveness to human governance? Local governments struggle with zoning laws when miracle services attract crowds larger than any existing facilities can accommodate. Noise ordinances become unenforceable when outdoor healing meetings operate around the clock. Property values skyrocket near areas where miraculous activity occurs regularly. Political parties find their traditional ideological differences becoming irrelevant when supernatural intervention provides practical solutions that transcend liberal or conservative approaches. The most successful politicians become those who can facilitate divine intervention rather than those who promise human solutions to social problems. Chapter 18: Climate Change Meets Divine Intervention. Dr. Elena Vasquez, lead climatologist at the National Weather Service, stares at satellite data that defies every model her team has developed for predicting atmospheric behavior. Across the globe, weather patterns are changing, not according to environmental factors, but in response to human prayer and divine intervention. The transformation begins when coastal communities facing devastating hurricanes discover that organized prayer services can literally calm approaching storms. Meteorologists watch in amazement as satellite images show hurricane systems dissipating moments after large groups gather to pray for divine intervention. Traditional weather forecasting becomes obsolete when supernatural authority can override natural atmospheric processes. Drought conditions that have persisted for years end overnight when miracle workers speak rain into existence over parched agricultural regions. Farmers abandon irrigation systems and weather modification technology in favor of prayer services that produce more reliable precipitation than any scientific method. Crop yields increase dramatically as supernatural provision ensures perfect growing conditions regardless of natural climate patterns. Ocean temperatures stabilize as marine biologists observe impossible regeneration in coral reef systems that were considered permanently damaged. Dead ocean zones spring back to life when miracle ministries focus prayer on marine ecosystem restoration. Fish populations multiply beyond sustainable limits, creating abundance where scarcity had threatened global food security. Forest fires stop spreading when confronted by prayer barriers created by communities of faith. Satellite thermal imaging shows fire lines halting at precise geographical boundaries where organized intercession occurs. Reforestation happens at supernatural speed as dead forests regenerate within days of receiving focused spiritual attention. Air quality improves dramatically in major metropolitan areas as supernatural intervention neutralizes pollution faster than environmental regulations could achieve. Smog disappears from cities where large-scale healing meetings occur regularly. Respiratory disease rates plummet as the atmosphere itself responds to divine healing power. The polar ice caps begin regenerating at rates that contradict all scientific projections about global warming. Arctic researchers observe impossible ice formation occurring in regions where temperatures remain above freezing. Antarctic ice sheets grow stronger and more stable as prayer networks focus on polar climate restoration. Environmental protection agencies struggle to develop new policies when supernatural intervention proves more effective than regulation for addressing climate issues. Carbon emission controls become irrelevant when divine power can neutralize atmospheric pollution directly. Environmental impact studies require complete revision when miraculous restoration can reverse decades of ecological damage overnight. Climate scientists attempt to develop new theoretical frameworks that incorporate spiritual variables into environmental modeling. Research methodologies expand to include prayer as a measurable factor in ecosystem health. The relationship between human spiritual activity and planetary climate becomes a new field of scientific investigation. Chapter 19: The question that changes everything. As we reach the end of this incredible journey through an alternative history, where miracles never ceased, we must confront the most challenging question of all. Would humanity actually be better in such a world? Or would we lose something essential about what makes us human? Consider the profound implications of living without struggle, scarcity, or mortality. Would humans develop the same depth of character, creativity, and compassion if every challenge could be instantly resolved through divine intervention? Some philosophers argue that growth comes through overcoming difficulties, that strength, wisdom, and empathy emerge from wrestling with limitations rather than experiencing unlimited power. Think about faith itself in a world where miracles happen daily. Would constant visible proof of divine power actually strengthen spiritual development? Or would it eliminate the need for the trust and hope that many consider essential to meaningful relationship with God? Perhaps faith requires some element of uncertainty to maintain its transformative power in human hearts. The question of human dignity becomes complex when supernatural intervention solves every problem. Does being created in God's image include the responsibility to wrestle with challenges, solve problems, and grow through adversity? Would humans retain their essential humanity if divine power removed all opportunity for struggle, achievement, and personal development through effort? Consider the psychological impact on generations who never experience loss, failure, or limitation. Would such people develop the empathy necessary to understand those who do suffer? Could they appreciate gifts they never lacked or understand sacrifice they never needed to make? The character traits we most admire, courage, perseverance, selflessness, might never develop in a world without need for them. Yet we must also consider the arguments on the other side. How many brilliant minds have been lost to preventable diseases that miraculous healing could have cured? How much human creativity has been stifled by poverty that supernatural provision could have eliminated? How many relationships have been destroyed by death that resurrection power could have prevented? Perhaps the most honest answer is that we cannot fully know whether such a world would be better or worse, only different in ways that would fundamentally alter what it means to be human. The question forces us to examine what we truly value about existence, growth, and our relationship with the divine. What does this alternative history reveal about your own expectations, hopes, and fears regarding supernatural intervention in your life? As you consider these possibilities, what do you find yourself longing for, and what do you discover you might not want to lose? Chapter 20: The Miracle You're Living. But here's the twist that will haunt your thoughts long after you finish this story. What if this alternative history isn't alternative at all? What if the miracles never actually stopped, but we simply learned to explain them away, categorize them as coincidences, or dismiss them as medical anomalies that don't fit our modern worldview? Consider the statistical impossibilities that happen around us regularly. The terminal cancer patient who recovers completely after doctors exhaust all treatment options. The accident victim who survives injuries that should have been fatal. The desperate family whose needs are met through coincidental generosity at precisely the right moment. The missing child found alive against all odds in circumstances that defy logical explanation. What if the only thing that changed wasn't God's power, but our willingness to recognize it? What if we've trained ourselves to look for natural explanations so thoroughly that we miss supernatural interventions happening right in front of us? Modern medicine might cure diseases, but what about the cases where healing happens faster or more completely than medical intervention can explain? Think about the prayer that was coincidentally answered exactly as requested, the danger you avoided because something made you change your plans at the last moment. The relationship, opportunity, or resource that appeared in your life with timing too perfect to be purely random. The moment you felt unexplained peace during your darkest crisis, or sudden strength when you thought you couldn't continue.